this is Hannah. My name's Hannah. I'm with Springfield Community Gardens, and I'm happy to introduce Patrick Byers, a field specialist and horticulturalist.
Thank you, Hannah. Yes, my name is Patrick Byers. I'm a horticulture field specialist with University of Missouri Extension based in Southwest Missouri. And it's been my pleasure to work with Springfield Community Gardens on a number of informational and educational workshops. And today's workshop is going to be focused on plant disease. And these workshops are intended for market gardeners, but they're also helpful for home gardeners and anyone who has an interest in the issues related to local food systems. So excited to be here and excited to have Hannah working with me on this particular workshop. So let's go ahead and get started.
Sounds good. I will be available for any chats or any questions that you guys may have in the chat, and I will announce the questions that you may have in the chat to Patrick as the presentation goes on. Also, there is a survey at the end of this workshop that is linked with the USDA, and if you could please fill out that survey, it'll help us provide more free educational workshops like this. Awesome.
Oh, okay, very good. Hannah, can we see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, and the sound quality is good?
Yeah.
Okay, very good, very good. Well, again, the subject of our workshop today is understanding plant diseases. And as Hannah mentioned, and I did as well, this is a program in conjunction with Springfield Community Gardens. And the vision of Springfield Community Gardens is a community where everyone has access to healthy local food. And as a horticulture field specialist, I'm very excited to be teaming with this vision. It's my vision as well. Springfield Community Gardens maintains a network of community gardens across the Springfield-Greene County area in Southwest Missouri. They also have a very innovative farmer incubator program. And if there's anyone who has an interest in becoming a farmer, please reach out to Springfield Community Gardens. They have qualified staff and programs in place to help you with realizing that particular dream. So again, Springfield Community Gardens, a huge asset for the local food system in Springfield-Greene County. And our workshop today is conducted with support from the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And the USDA, of course, has a huge interest in local food systems and especially crop farming. And we encourage anyone who is interested in learning more about USDA programs to visit the farmers.gov website, where the programs and the activities are described in detail. The Farm Service Agency maintains an office in most counties in Missouri and across the country. It's an excellent entry point to learn more about the USDA. The Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS, has a number of programs in place that directly support farmers who are interested in conserving natural resources, our water, our air, and our soil. And these programs, in many cases, are cost-share programs that help support innovative production practices. This morning we had a workshop on cover crops, and there are NRCS programs in place to support the use of cover crops. There's also a USDA NRCS program in place to support organic agriculture and to support production tools such as the use of high tunnels. So reach out to your NRCS conservationist and learn more about these programs. The Risk Management Agency is another branch of USDA that has programs that directly benefit specialty crop farmers. So our program today on plant diseases, we'll have some introductory material initially, and then we'll talk about what actually causes plant disease. We'll spend some time looking at bacteria, we'll look at fungi, we'll look at viruses, we'll look at mycoplasmas, and we'll look at nematodes, all of which can cause plant disease. We'll spend a little time talking about the disease triangle concept, and we have a video that illustrates that in a real-world setting. Then we'll spend some time talking about disease-integrated pest management and why managing diseases is not simply what do I spray. And then we'll spend the rest of our time together talking about what I feel are the top 8 practices to manage diseases in the garden or on the farm. And we'll illustrate those practices using tomato and a disease called Alternaria. At any point during the presentation, please feel free to type questions into the chat. Hannah will be monitoring chat, and she'll give me a cue or give me a sign when a question comes in, and we'll tackle it at that point. So please feel free to enter questions into the chat. So is plant health important? Is it important that we consider those things that can impact and limit plant health? Well, the answer certainly is yes. We depend upon plants. We depend upon plants and plant products for our existence as humans. Plants are the source of all food, either directly as we consume plants or indirectly as we consume animals that in turn consume plants. It's also a source for many other human needs related to things such as shelter, clothing. Medicines are based upon plant sources. Just plants interact and intersect with the human existence in so many different ways. And plants, of course, are important from the standpoint of environmental benefits. Plants help moderate the environment, particularly from the standpoint of reducing CO2 emissions, also in maintaining air quality, helping with managing water quality, helping maintain healthy soils, all of the things that go into a positive existence for us as humans. So again, yes, we do depend upon plants. Are plant diseases significant? Well, the answer there is yes as well. And all we have to do is look back at history and see what the impact of plant diseases can be. And let's take a look at some particularly significant examples. Late blight of potato. So in the early years of the 19th century, the food industry in Ireland was based upon a single crop, and that was the potato. The Irish potato was well suited for growing in the Irish environment, and people began to depend upon potatoes as a staple in their diet. And this is particularly the case with the poorer groups of people in Ireland. Well, unfortunately, a single strain of potato was grown across Ireland, and doubly unfortunately, that particular strain of potato was susceptible to a disease called late blight. And in 1844, the potato crop was lost to this disease. Of course, at that time, we didn't have pesticides to manage it, and indeed, it was poorly understood why the crop failed because of this disease, but it was definitely clearly understood what this crop failure meant, and what it meant was famine, starvation, and hardship for the Irish people. And in the 3 years following 1844, the blight returned, and the situation was so dire that many of the Irish emigrated. And it's estimated that 1 in 7 of the inhabitants of Ireland left the country, again, just to find an existence that was more secure and not so dependent upon a crop that was being destroyed. And it's interesting to look back. Many of us have Irish heritage, and in many cases, probably in most cases, the fact that we have Irish heritage can be traced back to the fact that our ancestors emigrated from Ireland in response to the potato disease late blight. Chestnut blight, another example. This was a disease that destroyed the American chestnut, which was a dominant forest tree in the eastern forests of North America. The blight arrived in 1904, and by 1940, most of the American chestnuts were gone. And these were huge trees, very important economically. They, of course, were an important part of the ecosystem of these forests as well. And there are places where the forest system is still recovering from the loss of this dominant species. Dutch elm disease, another disease. I can remember as a child when Dutch elm disease arrived in Iowa, where I grew up, and basically destroyed the shade trees across Des Moines, Iowa, which it was a dominant shade tree, not only in Des Moines, but across the country. And the loss of all of these trees over a 30 to 40 year period was significant. Obviously, it was devastating from the standpoint of the cost to cities and towns, but also had an impact on the quality of life for millions of Americans. Sudden oak death and remorum blight, a more recent problem, stands the potential to destroy oak trees across the country. And then thousand cankers disease, which has just recently become an issue the past 10 years. The potential is there for that to destroy the black walnut industry in the United States. So again, over $220 billion a year is lost to crop diseases. So yes, plant diseases are significant. A definition: what is a plant disease? A plant disease is any physiological or structural abnormality that's harmful to the plant. And we can look at these pictures and see some examples. It might be something that destroys a branch, as we see in that lower picture. That's black knot on a plum. Could be a disease that destroys the fruiting part of a crop, and that's corn smut on sweet corn. Or it could be something that affects the appearance or marketability of a crop. In this case, it's a virus disease on a begonia. But again, any physiological or structural abnormality that's harmful to a plant can be defined as a plant disease. two more definitions, and those definitions are symptom and sign. And it's important to understand the difference, because when we start talking about identifying diseases, in many cases we need to look at both the symptom and the sign. Okay, so here we have examples of two diseases. We have septoria leaf spot on a cottonwood, the lower right picture, and the upper right picture is fire blight on an apple fruit. So a symptom is the actual expression of the disease by a plant. It's how the plant reacts to a disease. And in these cases, it would be the spot on the cottonwood leaf, you know, the fact that it has a dark margin, the fact that it's rounded. These are all examples of symptoms. Looking at the apple, the fact that the apple has a darkened area that looks water-soaked, that's the symptom. Again, that's the response of the plant to the disease. The sign is the actual physical evidence of what caused the problem. And looking at that septoria leaf spot on cottonwood, those little dark spots in the center of the larger spot, that's the actual fruiting body of the fungus that causes septoria leaf spot. So it's the actual causal agent. It's the actual fungus. Looking at the upper picture of the apple with fire blight, notice the drops of ooze coming from that area on the apple. Those drops of ooze is actually the bacteria mixed with the exudates that the bacteria produce. So that, again, that's an example of the sign. That's the physical evidence of the actual causal agent. Now, people who study diseases break diseases into two types. Okay, one type are diseases that are caused by non-infectious orders. You know, we sometimes call them abiotic causes. And these are sometimes called disorders. They're usually the result of something like an environmental condition or a nutritional issue, you know, too much or not enough of a nutrient, perhaps damage from cold temperatures, perhaps damage from hot temperatures. But whatever caused the problem was abiotic, it was non-living. The other group of disease, and the group that we're going to focus on for today's workshop, are biotic infectious diseases. These are diseases that are caused by something living. And it could be a fungus, it could be a bacteria, it could be a virus, it could be a mycoplasma, it could be a nematode. Again, it's something that is living that causes the disease response in the plant. So what causes disease? You know, what are these living agents that cause diseases? I've been through this list already, but we'll talk about it again. So it could be a fungus. In fact, many diseases are caused by fungi. It could be a bacteria. It could be a virus. It could be a nematode. It could be a phytoplasma, or it could be a parasitic plant. I haven't mentioned that, but parasitic plants attack other plants and cause diseases. We collectively call these biotic agents plant pathogens. Okay, a pathogen is something that causes a response. In our case here, we're talking about pathogens that cause disease, cause plant diseases. Now, let's take a look at sort of a size scale comparison of the different causal agents, the different plant pathogens. And here we have a diagram that is the outline of a plant cell. That's sort of the basis of this. And then we can see various things that can attack that plant cell. Fungi, that lower picture there, you can see it looks a bit like a foot coming into. That would be a relative scale of the size of a fungus, part of a fungal body, compared to the size of a plant cell. The small oval, kind of down towards the lower left of the plant cell, is a bacteria. You notice the bacteria are considerably smaller than fungi, and they frequently move around by what are called flagellae. You can see that filament extending beyond the body of the bacteria that whips around, and that helps propel the bacteria. Then we get into viruses, which are very tiny, very difficult to see even under microscopes, but the group of organisms there at the very center, you can get an idea, relatively speaking, of the size of a virus compared to a plant cell. Looking at the upper part of this diagram, you see that kind of rounded thing protruding into the cell. That is the head of a nematode. Of all the causal agents we're going to discuss today, all the plant pathogens, nematodes are among the largest. And then phytoplasmas, we can see at the very center there, where it says mycoplasmas. These are examples of phytoplasmas, and they're intermediate in size between fungi, bacteria, and then viruses. A couple of other terms, and these are the terms parasite and saprophyte. Now, most plant pathogens we consider being parasites. These are organisms that live on or in another living organism, and they obtain their nutrients from it. So looking at that pumpkin there, we notice that we have these circular areas where the pumpkin is rotting. That's an example of an organism that is deriving its sustenance, its nutrition, from another organism, in this case the pumpkin. So that's an example of a parasite. So again, an organism living on or in another living organism and obtaining its nutrients from it. A saprophyte, on the other hand, obtains its nutrients from dead organic material. Yes, it feeds on something that was once living, but the actual impact of a saprophyte is much less because, again, it's feeding on something that's already dead, something that's on some stage of decomposition. That lower picture is a picture of a slime mold, and it's actually feeding on the mulch on the ground around the base of the tree. It's not feeding on the tree, it's actually feeding on the nutrients in the mulch as it breaks down. All right, let's talk about fungi first. And we're starting with fungi because they are actually the largest group of plant pathogens. They're multicellular organisms. They lack chlorophyll. They have to derive their nutrition from other plant sources, either living or dead plant sources. And there's more than 8,000 pathogenic species of fungi worldwide. The picture here shows a pathogenic fungi called orange rust on a blackberry leaf. And again, looking at our diagram there on the right, we can see the relative size to part of the body of a fungus compared to a plant cell. Now, 90% of fungi are saprophytes. You know, they don't feed on living plants. They're not harmful. In fact, some of these are beneficial and important economic crops. When we think about, for example, growing mushrooms, mushrooms are an example of a saprophytic fungi in most cases. We see some examples in this picture here. You can see a fairy ring there at the top and a puffball at the bottom. Again, and in many cases, these are actually beneficial organisms because they take part in the process of decomposition. And as they break down matter that was once living, this activity releases nutrients that can be used by plants. It also helps break down living plant matter into organic matter that becomes a more or less permanent part of the soil. And of course, there are lots of benefits related to organic matter in the soil. So again, just to reiterate, not all fungi are bad. In fact, the majority of fungi are neutral or even beneficial. It's only about 10% of the fungi that account for the majority of plant diseases. This picture here shows an example of a particularly significant one, which is peach brown rot. It's caused by a fungus with the generic name of Monolinea. Now, fungal diseases, there are a few cases where fungal diseases can actually, to some degree, move themselves. But in most cases, fungal diseases require some agent to move them around from one place to another. And some of the different ways that fungal diseases are spread, it could be on infected plants. You know, as we move transplants around or as we harvest plants and move them around, unwittingly, we can move infected plant material. And that can be the start of a new infection point. It could also be in the soil. As soil is moved around, there are a number of fungi that actually habit the soil. And as soil is moved around, these fungi can be spread as well. There are some fungi where they develop a resting stage called a spore, which are light enough to be blown on the wind. Fungi can also be spread in water splash. This is a common way that fungi are spread from debris on the soil up onto plants. You know, for example, the driving rain or overhead irrigation can actually splash fungal bodies or fungal spores from the soil up onto the foliage of plants. Fungi can be spread on seed. There are some cases where fungal diseases are seed-borne. And particularly if the seed was improperly managed, you can actually spread the fungus when you plant the seed. Insects can be effective agents of spread for fungi, and this would apply to things such as pollinating insects. It can also apply to insects that are feeding on plant parts, and they can unwittingly spread spores of these fungal plant pathogens on their bodies. Animals likewise can do that. People are a very effective agent or vector of spreading fungal diseases, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later on, but it's very important as you work on a farm and as you move from farm to farm that you consider ways to minimize the spread of diseases, fungal diseases and other diseases as well, on your person. This picture is a picture of a disease called southern blight, and it's attacking a tomato. The tomato will die. It's a serious disease on tomatoes. You'll notice that there are small round bodies in that white area at the base. Those are actually the fruiting bodies of the fungus that causes southern blight. And those bodies, it's very easy to dislodge them, and they end up in the soil. And then if you move soil, they can be spread. Those bodies can also be spread on the hands of workers or on the clothing or shoes of workers and cause new outbreaks of this particular disease. Those fungal bodies are very resistant, and they can remain in the soil for a long period of time until a host plant is planted close to them, and then they can begin to develop, and southern blight can then show up. What's particularly devastating about southern blight is that it tends to persist in the soil, and once introduced, it can be a problem for years in some cases after that. So it's very important to think about ways to minimize the spread of diseases like southern blight. Again, water is important in spore movement and infection. Looking at this planting of tomatoes, this actually was a case where there was southern blight in this field. And if you look at the right-hand side, you can see healthy plants at the end of the row. And as we move down the hill from that point, you can notice that the plants begin to look a little unthrifty. And then as we get to the lower part there, we have plants that are dying. And this is a case where those fruiting bodies of southern blight moved in water on top of the mulch, on top of the plastic mulch. And then they were washed into the planting holes where the tomato plants were and caused infection. So again, water movement is important. And when we think about managing fungal diseases, other diseases as well, water management is an important part of that particular strategy. Now, how do fungal diseases attack plants? How does infection take place? Well, fungal diseases are interesting. They certainly can take advantage of natural openings or wounds. There are natural openings in plants, such as the openings on leaves that allow for the exchange of gases. These are called stomata. There's also openings on the woody parts of plants called lenticels. There may be openings at the base of blossoms. There are lots of places where there are natural openings that fungal bodies or fungal spores can then penetrate the plant. But in some cases, fungi can actually penetrate plants actively. They produce enzymes which can break down protective layers on plants and allow the fungal body of the pathogen to enter the interior part of the plant. This is pretty much specific to fungi. Bacteria don't do this, viruses don't do this, mycoplasma don't do this either. But a number of fungal diseases can actually directly penetrate the tissue on the host plant. So there are lots of ways the fungal diseases express themselves, lots of different symptoms and signs. And let's take a quick look at some of the different symptoms and signs that we might see on plants that are under attack by fungal pathogens. Here we have an example of mildews. And mildews typically cause grayish layers either on the upper side of leaves and fruit or the undersides, depending upon the type of pathogen. And these, this gray powdery appearance is actually caused by chains of spores that are on the surface of the plant tissue. These diseases are easily spread on the wind and are very common on many types of plants, particularly if the environmental conditions favor the appearance of these diseases. Rust diseases. Here's an example of a rust disease. Rust diseases are interesting because in many cases, the disease requires more than one host for the pathogen to complete its life cycle. And in the case of cedar apple rust, one host is the eastern red cedar, the other host is the apple tree. And the result of infection on the apple are these orange or greenish orange spots on the foliage and on the fruit. Cankers. Cankers are infected areas in the woody part of a plant. In some cases, cankers are annual. In other cases, cankers can have a life period of longer than a year. They can become a more or less perennial part of that particular plant once infection takes place. This is Nectria canker, and it's on a peach tree. And you'll notice that we have both signs and symptoms here. The sign is actually the sunken area on the branch, whereas the sign are those orange dots that we see there towards the center of that sunken area. And these are actually the fruiting body of the fungus that causes Nectria canker. Some fungal diseases cause spots. Here's apple scab. We can see the spots on the apple and also on the foliage of the tree. In general, the spots caused by fungal diseases tend to be round in nature. And we'll compare and contrast that to the spots caused by bacterial diseases here in a moment. But with fungal diseases, typically we have a situation with a rounded or an oval shape to the spot. And we'll introduce another term here at this point, and that's the term lesion. Plant pathologists use that term to describe an infected area on a fruit, a leaf, or a stem, a lesion. It's somewhat synonymous with spot, but if I throw that term out there, that's what I'm talking about. But at any rate, with fungal diseases, the spots or the lesions typically are round or oval in shape. We can have blights. Blights can attack leaves, stems, or fruit, and they typically result in the larger scale death of tissue than spots. So if we look at these pictures, for example, we can see the effect of late blight on a tomato. It's killing the leaflets in the upper picture. We look down at that middle picture. That's what the disease looks like up close on the foliage, and the entire leaf is going to die. And then it can also cause problems on the fruit, and we notice those fruit lesions there that pretty much have made that fruit unmarketable. So again, a blight is a more widespread situation on the plant than, say, a spot. Damping off, the death and decay of germinating seedlings. Again, this is an example of a symptom of fungal infection that typically takes place at the root system or right at the soil level on the tender, vulnerable tissue of germinating seedlings. Wilts. We have fungal diseases that can cause widespread wilting on the plant, in some cases the entire plant, as we see at the bottom there, verticillium wilt attacking the strawberry, or it can cause wilting of a branch or a portion of a woody plant. And in this case, verticillium has attacked the root system and the side of the tree and the branches that are wilting. Verticillium is a disease that through its activity blocks the water conducting tissue of the plant. And the result, of course, is the wilting and death of the tissue above where the infection takes place. And then we have a wide range of rots. These could be fruit rots, they could be root rots, they could be stem rots, but a number of fungal diseases cause rots. And we've already talked about peach brown rot. We can see that up there at the center. We can see stem rot on the geranium and the euphorbia. And we can look down there on the lower picture and we can see root rots. So moving from fungal diseases, before we move on, do we have any questions in the chat?
It doesn't appear so, but
Okay.
Feel free to insert any questions if need be.
Thank you. Okay, now let's talk about bacteria as causes of plant diseases. And you know, as I mentioned earlier, by far the majority of plant diseases are caused by fungi, but there are a number of bacterial diseases that are of concern. Bacteria are much smaller than fungi. They can't be seen with a light microscope though, and they're typically simple organisms, oftentimes one-celled, and there's about 200 plant pathogenic species worldwide. So bacteria move in water or films of water with flagella. We can see this picture that was taken through a microscope. We can see the body of the bacteria. You can see the whip-like flagella behind it. And these move around and propel the bacteria through films of water. Now, what this tells us, of course, is that infection typically takes place when plant parts are wet. Leaves, foliage, stem, or root systems are wet. And in the case of bacteria, in almost every instance, the infection takes place through either a natural opening or some sort of wound that was created on the plant. And, you know, that wounding could be the result of cultural practices. It could be the result of cold damage. It could also be the result of an event such as a hailstorm. But something that has opened wounds on the plant now allows the entry of bacteria into the plant to cause diseases. And about 15% of plant diseases are caused by bacteria. Again, they're very small, and we can see a relative comparison of a bacteria to the size of the plant cell. And as far as their specific length, they're about 0.5 to 3.5 microns in length, and about 1.5 to 1.5 microns in diameter. And many of them tend to be that oval or rod-shaped. Bacteria reproduce by binary division, and this means that one cell divides into two, and then those two cells divide, and so on. And because of this means of reproduction, bacterial numbers can increase greatly if the environmental conditions are favorable and if there's a food source present. And so we can go from one cell, and within 24 hours, if all cells divide at 20-minute intervals and all cells survive, we can have 17 million cells within 24 hours. So that typically isn't the case, but we can still see there's a huge potential for a few cells to become a lot of cells and for a initial infection to become a serious plant disease in a short period of time. How are bacteria spread? Well, again, they can be spread on infected plant material and soil, water splash, pruning tools. Particularly if we're using pruning tools as a way to manage diseases, it's important to maintain the sanitation of these pruning tools. Insects can be effective at spreading bacteria, especially pollinating insects. Bacteria are commonly spread on seed, but again, people are implicated as a vector in many cases for the spread of bacterial diseases on our hands, on our clothing, on our shoes, and other interactions between people and plants. All right, so we talked about fungal diseases and symptoms and signs. Let's take a look at bacterial diseases. Blights are a common situation with bacterial diseases, and oftentimes bacterial diseases develop as a result of the ability of the bacteria to form these mixtures of polysaccharides and other materials that are very thick, that they tend to block the conducting tissues of plants, and the plant then dies from that point outward. This is an example of a bacterial disease, fire blight on apples. And once the fire blight bacteria enters the tree, it then moves into the vascular conducting tissue of the tree. It forms these polysaccharides that basically plug the conducting tissue of the tree. And the response of the tree, of course, is to be blighted and die from that point on. And we can see that sometimes we have what's called shoot blight. We can also have canker blight on the larger branches of an apple tree. But again, examples of blights caused by a bacteria. We can have spots caused by bacteria. These could be leaf spots, fruit spots. Now, this is a disease called bacterial spot of tomato, and if we look closely, we notice that the outline of those spots is not particularly uniform. It's not round or oval like a fungal spot. Frequently, the leaf or fruit spots caused by bacteria are angular. Notice again, these spots here almost look like polygons. With leaf spots, typically bacterial leaf spots are, again, they're angular. Their margins are bounded by the veins of the leaf. And this is an important diagnostic tool in distinguishing between fungal diseases and bacterial diseases. Bacterial wilts, again, these are somewhat like blights, but bacterial wilts, a similar situation. This is a disease called cucumber wilt. And if we look at the upper picture, this is an example of symptoms, the wilting and collapse and death of the entire cucumber plant. And a common diagnostic tool for identifying bacterial wilt on cucumbers is to cut the stem, to hold the pieces together, and then gently draw them apart. And if the bacteria are present, we see this it's called streaming, but it's the formation of these streams that are made up of those polysaccharides that the bacteria have produced. Again, these are what are plugging up the conducting tissue of the cucumber vine. And this, again, can be a useful way to identify bacterial wilt on cucumbers. Soft rots are a common symptom of bacterial infection. Here's an example of a soft rot on potato. Another clue that the causal agent is a bacteria rather than a fungal caused rot is the odor. Part of diagnostics is it's not just looking at things with your eyes, but using the rest of your senses as well. And frequently a sniff of the infected part of something like this tomato will reveal a foul smell, and typically the worse it smells, the more likely it is to be caused by bacteria. Galls. Galls are abnormal growth of plant tissue, and they can be present on the woody parts of plants like we see on the base of this apple tree, or they could be galls on the herbaceous part, the green growing parts of the plant. But galls are basically tissue that is growing irregularly, not growing as normal, and frequently it does this in response to the infection of a bacteria, in this case the crown gall bacteria. And what this particular bacteria does is it actually hijacks the cells with the genetic mechanism within these cells and inserts part of its DNA into the host plant's DNA. And the response then are for these cells to grow uncontrollably. It's somewhat analogous to a cancer in a higher organism. And we can see the effects of that in the formation of the crown gall. Any questions on bacterial diseases, Hannah?
Not currently.
Okay, very good. Now let's turn our attention to viruses. And of course, viruses are definitely in the news as far as causing human diseases, but viruses can also cause plant disease. Viruses are tiny, very tiny, and they cannot be seen with a light microscope. It takes an electron microscope to see viruses. And they're extremely simple. They're basically just a nucleic acid with a protein coat. And in fact, there are people who maintain that viruses are actually not living at all, but for our purposes, we're going to consider them as a biotic cause of plant diseases. They cannot reproduce on their own in the environment. They have to basically enter a host where they hijack the host's reproductive machinery. In other words, they cause the host to replicate the virus. And the virus then multiplies only in the host plant. This is why viruses don't survive on inert surfaces, but it takes infection of a host for the virus to then reproduce. These are less common as far as plant pathogens, as causal agents, and only about 5% of plant diseases are caused by viruses. Viruses have to be spread by a vector. Again, they're not very effective at spread otherwise, and certainly they can be spread by infected plants. And as we plant new plants in a garden, if those plants bring with them viruses, then we've unwittingly introduced that virus into our garden or onto our farm. They can also be spread by grafting. If we're grafting and for example, if we're interested in grafting apples and the tree that we select as the source of our scion wood is infected with viruses, the potential is there that every piece of scion wood that we collect from that tree could contain viruses, and all the new trees that we generate through grafting will contain those viruses. But frequently, viruses are spread by living vectors. And a good example is insects. Here we see a picture of aphids. And aphids are very effective vectors of a number of different types of viruses. And the way this works is the vector feeds on a plant that is infected with the virus. It draws the plant's juices, the sap and other things into its body, and it carries the virus along with it into its body. And then when it moves to another plant and begins to feed, in most cases, the virus can then move from the inside of the vector into the new plant. And again, aphids are very effective at doing this. Whiteflies are implicated as vectors. There are a number of other insects that are very effective vectors for viruses. When we look at the soil situation, nematodes can spread viruses from one plant to another through their feeding on plant root systems. Humans can spread viruses. There were some notorious cases of viruses spread that originated in tobacco. And then as people smoked or used tobacco, those viruses would end up on their hands. And then these viruses could then be spread to plants just through human activity. And again, a good case in point was tobacco mosaic virus, which is also causes a disease in tomatoes. And so if a smoker had the virus present on their hands from tobacco products and then they worked in tomatoes, they could spread the disease to the tomato plants. And then a number of viruses are spread on seeds. Virus diseases are systemic. And what this means is that once a plant's infected, there's really no way to cure the disease. We have to focus on prevention in managing viral diseases. Now, some of the symptoms of virus diseases, sometimes the symptoms are just general in nature. And here we see two pepper plants side by side, a healthy pepper plant and a pepper plant that is virus infected. And if we look closely at the weaker plant, the plant with the smaller leaves, we also notice some leaf discoloration. Again, these are all symptoms of a virus infection. We can also see situations with changes in color. And here's a sort of a historical example. These are tulips, and they are exhibiting what's called a color break, where the pigment patterns in the petals are disrupted by the presence of a viral disease. Other examples of viruses, we can see leaf patterns such as ring spots or mottling or mosaics. And that upper picture is a picture of blackberry yellow vein disease on blackberry. And we can see patterns, interesting patterns on the fruit as well. That lower picture is tomato spotted wilt virus. And it causes these circular areas on the fruit. And of course, the fruit is unmarketable. And then mosaic patterns. We see cucumber mosaic. There's what it looks like on the fruit, the darkened areas. And then the lower picture is a picture of cucumber mosaic on the foliage. Now let's turn our attention to nematodes. Nematodes are larger in scale than the other pathogens that we've talked about. And you can see in that upper picture the relative size of the head of a nematode. They can be seen with light microscopes, although some of the very largest nematodes can be seen with the unaided eye. Only a few nematodes are actually plant parasites, about 10%. Many of them feed by using what are called stylet specialized mouthparts. And these are a bit like a hypodermic syringe, where the nematode approaches the plant, and then when it comes into contact, it penetrates the plant with its mouthpart. And then once the stylet mouthpart is inserted into the plant cell, it draws out the plant cell contents. Nematodes, again, are unsegmented worms. They reproduce by eggs, and in most cases, they are root feeders. They feed on the root systems of plants. There are a few cases where plant parasitic nematodes feed on the above ground part of the plant, but they're primarily feeding on the root systems. They're spread by infected soil, by plants that are infected and then moved, and then on plant debris. Very common to spread nematodes in soil. And we'll talk a little bit later about the importance of cleaning off machinery as you move from bed to bed or from farm to farm. And especially if you're borrowing machinery, make sure that you do a good thorough job of cleaning and sanitizing that equipment before using it on your farm. So here's some examples of nematodes. The upper left picture is nematodes feeding on the outside of a root hair. Again, root hairs are tiny, so that gives you an idea of the relative scale of the nematodes. And these nematodes have penetrated the root hair with their mouth parts, and they're feeding. Some nematodes actually feed inside root hairs, and the upper right picture shows nematodes that are inside of a root hair. We have some foliar nematodes. I mentioned there are a few that feed on the above ground part of the plant, and that's an example of nematodes coming out of the stem of a leaf. And then the lower picture there, these are called cyst nematodes, and they are interesting in that as they feed, they more or less form a permanent attachment to the root system, and then they develop into this. The plant root system responds by developing these cysts that sort of encase and protect the nematodes and allow a good feeding site for the nematode. Some of the symptoms of nematode diseases. A common symptom, of course, is on the root systems, and obviously it's easy to miss these symptoms if we don't unearth plants, but part of the diagnostic process on plant diseases is to examine the entire plant. And we may have above ground symptoms, but the actual cause may be at or below the soil surface. So it's important to look at root systems, and if we see these thickened areas and swellings on the root system, that's a fairly good indication that we're dealing with a nematode issue, perhaps a root knot nematode. A closer examination of the roots may reveal the cysts of cyst nematodes, and then sometimes we have symptoms of foliar nematodes. Here we have a hosta and a pachysandra that are showing symptoms of foliar nematodes. A nematode disease, nematode-based disease that was particularly devastating for Christmas tree farmers was pine wilt nematode. And Scots pine in particular is susceptible to damage from this particular pathogen. And it causes the death of the trees, and we can see that here. And in fact, it's radically changed the types of trees that we can grow for Christmas tree production here in the Midwest. And very few farmers are growing Scots pine because of its susceptibility to pine wilt nematode. Phytoplasma is another group of pathogens that can cause plant disease. They're somewhat like bacteria, but they're smaller. They have no cell walls. Like bacteria, they reproduce by cell division, and these particular bacteria are found within the phloem. When we think about the tissues in a stem, at the very center we have the xylem, then we have the vascular cambium, and then we have the phloem on the outside that's beneath the bark or the outer layer of a root or a stem or a leaf. And phytoplasmas typically are limited to the phloem layer in the stem. But again, they're quite tiny. Typically, you'll need an electron microscope to really get a good look at them. Like viruses, they are primarily spread by a vector, okay? An example would be leafhoppers. This is a leafhopper here. Leafhoppers feed using their piercing sucking mouthparts, where they actually penetrate the cells of a plant, and they feed by drawing the sap out. And again, if they feed on an infected plant, they can draw the sap out with the phytoplasmas present, and then as they move to another plant and begin feeding again, those phytoplasmas can be introduced into the second plant. They're obligate parasites, which means they have to be either inside a host or inside a vector. So again, someone like viruses, they typically don't exist outside of a host. Some examples of phytoplasmic symptoms and signs: virescence. This is the development of green pigment in tissues where we don't normally see it. And this is an example of a disease called astruyellows on Rudbeckia. Normally the blossoms are lavender in color, but here we see plants infected with a phytoplasma that has caused the blossoms to develop fluorescence. It can also just cause abnormal growth. This is astruyellows, the same problem that caused the virescence on the Rudbeckia in garlic. And we can see the plants declining and dying as a result of astruyellows. I mentioned that parasitic seed plants can be a cause of plant disease. There's just a few that we're concerned with here in Missouri, but two of them are dodder and mistletoe. And these parasitic seed plants do not contain chlorophyll. They really can't generate their own food. They get their sustenance by parasitizing and feeding on other plants. They are true plants. They reproduce through seeds, and their agent of spread typically are birds or infected seed lots, particularly in the case of dodder-infested seed lots. But birds are a very effective vector for parasitic seed plants such as mistletoe or dodder. And again, there's an example of mistletoe. All right, so we've taken a look at fungi, we've taken a look at bacteria, we've talked about viruses, we've talked about phytoplasmas, we've looked at nematodes, and we've looked at parasitic plants, all of which can be causes of disease, all of which can be plant pathogens. Now I'd like to introduce the concept of the disease triangle. Okay, we've already defined what pathogens are. These are the causal agents for disease, but a triangle has 3 points. Okay. And when we think about the conditions that cause disease, we can think about a 3-pointed situation as well. So the first point is the pathogen, which we've already defined. The second point is a susceptible host, a host that can get the disease. There's something about that host that makes it a good point of infection for a causal agent or a plant pathogen, and then the disease develops. So that's the second point of the disease triangle. The third point is the favorable environment. We can have a pathogen present, and we can have a susceptible host, but if the environment is not favorable, we will not see the development of the disease. And to give you an example, let's go back to our brown rot of peach example. Almost all peaches are susceptible to brown rot. So if you're growing a peach tree, the susceptible host is present. The pathogen is widespread. It's found wherever peach trees are grown, but there are also wild plants that can be hosts for this particular pathogen. So it's likely that the pathogen is somewhere in the vicinity of the susceptible host. Now, with these 2 points in place, all we need is a favorable environment for the disease to develop. And typically in the case of brown rot, what that means is free water present on the developing fruit early in the growing season. So the point following flowering to when the fruit is probably about the size of a tennis ball, it is susceptible to infection from brown rot. And if there's free water present for a long enough period of time on that fruit, then brown rot will develop. On the other hand, if free water is not present on the fruit, it's less likely that the disease will develop. So in other words, if we have a warm, wet, favorable environment, we'll see brown rot. But if the environment is dry and if there's no free water present, it's less likely that brown rot will develop. So again, to see a disease, we have to have a susceptible host, a pathogen present, and a favorable environment. Let's take a look at a video that illustrates the concept of the disease triangle. Okay, Hannah, can we see the video?
No, unfortunately, I don't see it.
Oh, no problem. I'll need to stop share and then reshare with the video. Okay, can we see the video now?
Yes.
Okay, very good. So this video is discussing cedar apple rust, and we're talking about integrated pest management. But again, the key point to take away from this is the definition of the disease triangle. and how we can look at a particular disease and think about how that disease becomes a problem and how we can manage it by understanding that concept. I'm Patrick Byers, Field Specialist in Horticulture with University of Missouri Extension. Integrated Pest Management, or IPM, is a science-based, common-sense approach to managing the insects, diseases, weeds, and other pests that plague specialty crop growers. Let's talk about integrated pest management as it relates to disease management, and we'll use cedar apple rust as our model. Cedar apple rust is an interesting disease. Like many of the rust diseases, it shares two hosts, the cedar, the eastern red cedar, and an apple tree. And the disease spends part of its life cycle on one host and part of its life cycle on the other host. Cedar apple rust overwinters on the eastern red cedar as hard knots that we call galls. In April, after a rain, those galls will then erupt and develop these orange growths that are called teleohorns. At this stage, spores are then spreading from the cedar host to the apple. On the apple, the result will be orange to yellow spots on the foliage and sometimes on the fruit. In a year of severe infestation, there can be enough damage to the foliage that the leaves drop, and after a number of years of infection with cedar apple rust, the tree can be weakened and made susceptible to other problems. When we think about integrated pest management and disease management, it's helpful to think about what's called the disease triangle. A triangle has 3 points, and when we talk about diseases, there are 3 points that we're interested in. Before a disease can become a problem, first of all, we need a susceptible host. Secondly, we need environmental conditions that favor the development of the disease. And third, we need the presence of the disease. In the case of cedar apple rust, let's take a look at each one of the points of that triangle. First of all, let's turn our attention to the apple tree. This apple tree is a cultivar called Enterprise. Enterprise has genetic resistance to cedar apple rust. In other words, the natural genetic makeup of this tree makes it resistant to the development of cedar rust disease. So that's very helpful from the standpoint of managing disease. Again, it's looking at that first point of the triangle, which is the presence of a susceptible host. Now let's talk about modifying the environment. And if we look at this tree, we notice that it has been pruned to a modified central leader system, a very open system. There's plenty of room for air to move throughout the branches of this tree. The foliage and the fruit dry quickly after a rain. Cedar rust is more of a problem if there are prolonged periods of wetting on the foliage and the fruit. So by training the tree in this fashion, we have developed an environment that is less favorable for the development of cedar apple rust. Third, let's take a look at the presence of the disease. As I mentioned, cedar apple rust overwinters on the eastern red cedar, and it overwinters as these galls that we see here. If these galls are not present in the vicinity of the apple tree, then we have fewer problems with cedar apple rust. So one aspect of managing cedar apple rust is to eliminate the alternate host, or the other side of the disease. If we notice that adjacent to our orchard, we have some eastern red cedar trees, and it would be beneficial from the standpoint of managing cedar apple rust using IPM to remove those trees. That would remove the overwintering site for this disease and reduce the amount of cedar apple rust that might be present close to our apple trees. So to review, from the standpoint of integrated pest management and diseases, it's useful to think about the disease triangle: the presence of a susceptible host, an environment that favors the disease, and the presence of the disease itself. In the case of cedar apple rust, by selecting resistant cultivars, by training and pruning the trees to an open structure, by removing the overwintering side of the disease, the eastern red cedars, we can reduce the situation of cedar apple rust infection in our apple orchard. Okay, let's go back to our presentation. Okay, Hannah, are we back to the slideshow?
Yes, that looks great.
Okay, fabulous. Do we have any questions related to the disease triangle and that concept?
No questions, but it's a brilliant concept. I love that it's a triangle.
Yeah, it is. And again, it's a really nice illustration of the fact that 3 things have to be present before we have plant disease: a susceptible host, the favorable environment, and the plant pathogen. Well, now let's talk about integrated pest management, or IPM. And basically, IPM is an effective and environmentally sensitive approach to pest management. As I said in the introduction, IPM is not based solely on the choice of a pesticide. IPM is it's an approach that looks at all aspects of managing problems. Again, the very name suggests integrated, the parts work together. Pest, a problem, and management, control, direct influence. And so we're going to talk about the strategies that we have available to manage diseases using integrated pest management. The first step of an effective integrated pest management program is to identify the pests correctly. And this is critically important. As we mentioned at the beginning, we can have situations where there are abiotic causes of plant disease. We can see symptoms on plants that are caused by nutritional problems or caused by weather situations. And we have to identify what those are compared to those diseases caused by biotic or living agents when we start to think about managing them. For example, if we have a problem on a blueberry where the leaves are yellowish, well, it could very well be caused by a nutritional problem. And in that case, we're not going to be spraying anything on the plant. We're going to be addressing the nutritional problem. The proper identification, of course, is critical. Accurate diagnosis is critical to developing your management strategy. Sometimes what we see as a problem is not a problem at all. It may just be a natural point or a natural appearance of the plant at some point in its life cycle. And there may be situations where what appears to be a pest really isn't a pest. Maybe an incidental issue that we can address by reaching up and removing it with our hand, and we don't need to take any additional control measures. Sometimes there's really nothing to be done. For example, in the case of virus infections, and at that point, the management may be just removal of that plant. And then proper identification is really important from the standpoint of economic sustainability because it saves time, energy, and especially money. We talked about the causes of plant disease, whether they're abiotic stresses or biotic stresses. And sometimes diagnosis can be challenging. There are commonly, okay, so are the diseases that commonly occur. And with any degree of experience, a farmer or gardener will learn to recognize those. Those are the diseases that we expect to see every year that there are many of our plants are susceptible to, and the environment is favorable. We expect to see those every year. But sometimes unusual things happen. Sometimes unexpected symptoms or signs show up. And if you ever need help with diagnosis, please reach out to University of Missouri Extension. We have trained faculty in place to identify problems. We have horticulture specialists that are stationed across the state to help with diagnosing situations. There are other resources available, such as resources with the Missouri Department of Agriculture. We have diagnostic services available from universities, and it's a good practice to have a reference library in place as well. The internet can be helpful, but screen your internet resources. Make sure that they're applicable to, for example, your geographic location. Some of the problems that show up in Australia just don't occur in Missouri. Some of the problems that show up in California don't occur in Missouri. Make sure that the resources that you tap into on the internet are applicable to our realities here in Missouri. The next step is to monitor pest populations on a regular basis. In other words, you're going to be watching your plants for signs and symptoms. If it's a disease that we expect every year, then we plan to take measures every year. But we always want to be keeping an open mind. We always want to be looking at plants and watching for the development of symptoms and signs. Phenology is important. Phenology is basically understanding different growth stages and when disease attacks may occur. In the case of brown rot on the peaches that we've discussed earlier, the first attacks typically take place as the fruit emerges from the blossom. This is called the shuck split phase. Typically occurs about 2 weeks after the petals drop from the blossom. And that's a point where you want to start watching for it, because this is when the initial infections take place. And then, of course, what is the real cause of the symptoms? You definitely want to look beyond just the above ground part of the plant. If you're seeing evidence of a disease, you want to look at the crown, you want to look at the root system. Examine the entire plant and keep an open mind. Again, regular inspections are necessary, and here you can see an extension specialist looking at the soil in a tomato house. And what we're actually identifying in this picture is southern blight. And I'm looking at the base of the plant, I'm looking at the soil near the base of the plant, looking for those fruiting bodies of the southern blight fungus. You can't see it, but in my other hand, I have a 10x hand lens, and this can be a very useful diagnostic tool to help you look, beyond just your normal eyesight to look for signs and symptoms of disease. And again, regular inspections are necessary. This is something you should be doing on an ongoing basis whenever you're working with your plants. Determine the action threshold. You're keeping an eye on the population level of the pest, of the disease. You're going to be thinking about the economic threshold and the economic injury level. So let's go ahead and define these concepts. So the economic threshold, this is the point where you need to start taking measures to prevent a manageable problem from becoming an economically injurious problem. In other words, a problem that you can manage to a problem that you can't manage, and you're going to see consequences, either economic consequences or just loss of crop. Economic injury level, this is the point where you can no longer tolerate damage. At this point, economic loss is happening, or in the case of a home garden, you're losing crop. And you can see this graphically if we take a graph where we have time on the x-axis, pest population on the y-axis, again, level of disease. And typically what we see over time is we see diseases build, and then they get to a point where they level off. The economic threshold is at some point during the sort of the building phase of the disease, the development of symptoms and signs. This is the economic threshold. This is the point where we need to make a decision as far as management. Here's the economic injury level. From this point on, we're experiencing either the loss of income on that crop or the loss of crop itself in the case of a home garden. And so the point where we need to take action is between these two lines. The next step, of course, is to choose the proper management tactic or combination of tactics. And in many cases, it's a combination of tactics from the standpoint of managing diseases. And we'll take a look at what these strategies are here. We have at our disposal biological controls, mechanical controls, cultural controls, genetic controls, and finally chemical controls. And I didn't leave chemical controls until last as a chance thing. In most cases, a grower who is interested in sustainability on a farm or in a garden needs to be looking at these other strategies before looking towards chemical control. Granted, there are many diseases where the most effective management strategy is chemical control, but there are many other cases where one of these other strategies will give adequate control of a disease. So biological control, again, taking advantage of the environment and the organisms that are present in the environment. In some cases, these are naturally occurring. For example, there are two organisms, Bacillus subtilis and Streptomyces lidicus, which are bacteria that actually can combat plant pathogenic bacteria and fungi. And so using these in a preemptive way, you can actually establish populations of these organisms on plants. And then they will make the environment less suitable for pathogenic bacteria and fungi than to take hold. We also have natural control products based upon minerals, oils, and biologicals that can be applied to plants. Reality check, biological controls typically are not complete. We have to be able to tolerate some level of damage, or we can combine biological controls with other management strategies to give a higher degree of control. Also, control is slow. It may not be immediate, as is the case with synthetic fungicides, and it generally is not persistent. These controls need to be reapplied at intervals to maintain the beneficial aspect of them. Mechanical control. In the case of diseases, we can prune out diseased plant parts. We can also remove the overwintering sites or stages of these diseases. Cultural control, this is huge. The way that you grow plants in the garden or on the farm has direct implications from the standpoint of developing a favorable environment for disease development. So again, think about that disease triangle. Here we're focusing on managing the environment to make it less conducive for diseases. And the bottom line is healthy plants are the best defense against diseases. And so everything that you can do as a gardener or as a farmer to grow healthy plants is going to be important. Certainly the framework under which you're growing, a healthy soil, choosing the right cultivars for your environment, and making sure you start with clean planting, plant stock, clean seeds, those sorts of things are critically important. Crop rotation is very important. Crop rotation can help delay or even eliminate the buildup of soil-borne diseases. And what crop rotation means, of course, is growing different crops, unrelated crops in sequence at a particular site, in a bed or in a high tunnel or wherever it might be, and then moving to different groups, different relational groups as you rotate. So in other words, you might plant a tomato crop and then follow that with a cole crop and then follow that with a cover crop. But again, using plant groups that are unrelated, that don't share the same spectrum of diseases. Cover cropping is a very important aspect of managing diseases, and there's some excellent resources out available to help guide farmers or gardeners in the proper use of cover cropping to manage plant diseases. Prepare the site properly before planting. Use proper planting techniques. Again, planting at the right time to encourage good, healthy growth is important. And then think about the conditions that are needed for optimum growth, those things such as proper watering, fertilizing, mulching, and weed control. And we'll talk more about these here in just a moment. And then proper pruning and training is important to develop an environment where diseases are less likely to take hold. You know, think back to that video on cedar rust and the importance of training apple trees to an open structure to reduce the period of time in which leaves and fruit remain wet. This is a very important management strategy for cedar apple rust. And the same thing applies to many other diseases. If you can maintain an environment that is not favorable to the disease, you won't see the disease. And the sanitation is important as well. So removing diseased plant parts, cleaning up an area at the end of a crop, and then disinfecting and cleaning things such as the insides of high tunnels, plant stakes, supportive structures, hoops, all those other things that could become lodging points for a disease inoculum. Genetic control, really important to use adapted cultivars. In other words, select cultivars that will work well under your environmental growing conditions. You know, select those cultivars that are suitable for Missouri. Whenever possible, choose cultivars that have genetic resistance to pests. In the case of grafted plants, don't just focus on the above ground part of the plant, focus on the root system as well. Tomatoes, for example, we have tomato rootstocks that can actively combat soil-borne diseases. So they're good choices in situations where there may be a soil disease present where tomatoes are to be grown. Genetically modified cultivars, there's some interest here in developing cultivars that have resistance to diseases that are then inserted into the genomes of existing crop plants. And then finally, chemical control. And this is using a pesticide to prevent or suppress a disease outbreak. And when we think about the use of chemicals, this is a very deliberative process. It's not a haphazard. It's not a, well, I use that for one thing and maybe I can use it for something else. It's something that has to be a very deliberate decision from the standpoint of, first of all, selecting the right chemical. Secondly, selecting a chemical that can be legally used for the desired purpose. And third, to minimize the damage that chemical might do to the environment, to beneficial insects, or to other helpful things that might be present in the environment where the chemical is being used. So again, a very deliberate process. Make sure that the pesticides chosen are specific to the disease. Use at the lowest effective rate. Try to select those that are short-lived in the environment. Yes, they may need to be applied more than once, but generally you limit collateral damage if you use pesticides that are short-lived in the environment. Make sure you select pesticides that are least toxic to beneficial organisms. For example, now it's a common situation where the label of the pesticide will include information on how to minimize injury to honeybees. Very important thing to consider. In using chemicals, make sure that you use practices that reduce the development of resistance. Many diseases, just by their nature, can develop resistance to pesticides. And a fungicide that works well this year may not work so well next year, and the year after may be completely ineffective. So it's important to alternate the pesticides, the fungicides that are used to manage diseases, to use different modes of action to slow down or prevent the buildup of resistance. And then, yes, it may be needed to use a general application over an entire bed, but after that, follow it only with spot applications as needed. In other words, repeat general applications will definitely make the collateral damage much greater than a general application followed by spot applications. Keep in mind that chemical pesticides are the most effective way to manage a number of diseases, and they also are helpful when used in concert with other non-chemical practices. Make sure that you understand the label. The label guides the legal and safe use of that pesticide, so make sure that you follow it to the letter. And again, remember, pesticides are just one choice. You shouldn't be using them indiscriminately. They should be used only after deliberation. Recognize that in some cases, pesticides substitute for labor. And if labor is not available, then a pesticide may be the most economically viable way to manage a disease. And then the final step is to take a look at the plan at the end of the season and see if it worked. Evaluate the plan, where there are strong points, where there are weak points. Do changes need to be made for the next production cycle? Again, what worked well, what needs improvement, what should be eliminated? And then just to review the steps of effective IPM: identify pests correctly, monitor pest populations, determine action thresholds, choose the right management tactic or combination of tactics, and then evaluate whether or not the plan worked. Okay, Hannah, do we have any questions at this point about IPM?
We do not.
Okay. I'd like to spend the rest of our time now talking about the top 8 things to manage diseases on the farm or in the garden. And this is based upon my experience of 30 plus years as a horticulture field specialist, yes, but also especially on the experience of hundreds of farmers that I've had a chance to interact with over the years, and the success strategies that they have reported on their farms. So we have a lot of collective wisdom going into these top 8 things to manage diseases. So the first thing is to know your crops. And here we see a blackberry, and we have to understand what's going on here. So this is a disease called anthracnose, and it's striking the fruit. And yes, it's a problem now, but if we want to manage this disease, we have to know that management starts before the blackberry even leaves out in the spring. And a delayed dormant application of sulfur-containing fungicide will help manage anthracnose. So we have to know our crops and what we can do relative to those crops to manage the disease issues. So again, what does knowing your crops mean? Well, first of all, what diseases should I expect? Am I going to see anthracnose? Well, if I'm growing susceptible blackberries and the environment is favorable, I could probably expect to see it. Whenever possible, it's important to source clean seed. If a farmer or gardener is saving their own seed, there are hot water treatments that you can use to make sure that seeds don't unwittingly carry bacteria or fungal diseases on the seed. If you're purchasing transplants, give them a quick check to make sure that they are not disease infected before you even start out. And if you're buying perennial plants, seek out virus-tested plants. This picture shows an example of blackberry plug plants. And this is an excellent way to start a blackberry planting. These are plants that are actually developed through a process called tissue culture. And they are generated under aseptic conditions in a lab. The parent plants that were originally sourced for the cells that are used in tissue culture are tested repeatedly for viruses, and only clean plants are used. And so if we purchase these plug plants and we plant them, these tissue culture plug plants, and plant them, we can be reasonably sure that we're starting off with virus-clean plants at planting time. And then, of course, plant at the proper time. Number 2, know the diseases. We saw this disease earlier. This is cedar apple rust, and we have to understand, first of all, the disease itself, how to identify it, but also its life cycle and the host that it might strike. Again, we have to understand that relationship between diseases and hosts. So again, thinking about the disease triangle can be very helpful at this point. Understanding the relationship between diseases and the environment. So again, there are the 2 points of the triangle. Susceptible host and favorable environment. We need to understand disease life cycles. The reason that this is important is there are typically points during a life cycle where we as farmers or gardeners can intervene. And in many cases, we can prevent disease by intervening at the appropriate time. In other words, we may be applying a fungicide at a particular time to prevent an infection from taking place when the environment is favorable. That may be the only time that we have to intervene. And if we do a good job then, we don't have to deal with that disease from that point on. We also need to become good diagnosticians. We need to learn to recognize disease symptoms and signs. And then again, always keep in mind the disease triangle. It's a very useful concept, Hannah, as you mentioned earlier, in understanding the situation with diseases. Choose your cultivars carefully. This is the third point that farmers frequently mention to me. And farmers who are interested in long-term sustainability on their farms are always looking at new cultivars. They're always looking at developments coming along from breeding programs to develop crop plants that are better suited for production situations. This is an example of a tomato called Juliet. And Juliet is a tomato that has multiple disease resistance. It's has good growth characteristics. It's a productive tomato, good quality, a very marketable tomato. It's fairly small, but it's more of a paste type tomato, and it's absolutely delicious. And you can see my grandson there in the picture with his bowl of Juliets getting ready to devour them all. And that boy's been known to eat, that boy's been known to eat 5 Juliet tomatoes in one sitting. Again, when we think about cultivars, we always want to think about disease resistance. Here's 2 apples. The leaf on the right is Enterprise, which doesn't get cedar apple rust. It has genetic resistance. The leaf on the left is Gold Rush, which is a good apple otherwise, but it is susceptible to cedar apple rust. We always want to think about adaptation to the environment. Here's a grapevine that has crown gall, and we talked about crown gall earlier. It's a bacterial disease that becomes an issue when something has injured the plant. And in the case of grapes, those grape cultivars that are sensitive to cold temperatures during the winter tend to have more problems with crown gall. And what's happening here is that cold temperatures damage the plant. They disrupt cell walls. They can damage the even the woody part of plants. And then once this damage has occurred, then those cells become susceptible to infection from the crown gall bacteria. And then the result are these galls or these growths, which can be very damaging to the grapevine. Grapevines that are hardy typically have fewer issues with crown gall. Fourth point, eliminate wild hosts. Farmers who grow solanaceous crops like eggplant and tomatoes and peppers will understand what I'm talking about here when they see these 2 pictures. These are different growth stages of the horse nettle. And the horse nettle is an interesting weed. It's a native plant, it's a weed, but it's also in the same family as the tomato, the eggplant, and the pepper. It's in the Solanaceae family. And this particular weed can host diseases that can then spread to our cultivated solanaceous crops. So an important aspect of managing these diseases would be eliminating these wild hosts. And this particular weed is a tough one to manage. It's a perennial, it persists, it's resistant to herbicides. It's a challenge to manage it, but it's important to put effort into controlling this particular weed because it can be a source of disease inoculum. So again, remember that, that third point of the triangle, the presence of the disease. If the wild host is present, there's a good likelihood that the disease is also present. So spending some time eliminating wild hosts can pay huge dividends later on. Some of the other weeds that we want to be concerned about, wild brassicas, things such as wild mustards and other relatives of our crops, our brassica crops like cabbage, broccoli, and cauliflower. This can be helpful. We already talked about solanaceous species. Pigweed and lamb's quarter can host viruses that can then strike our crop plants. Wild blackberries are a host for virus diseases and other diseases such as that orange rust we saw earlier. Wild prunus species can host brown rot. Feral pears can be a source of fire blight, which can spread to cultivated pears. Weeds around and inside protective structures. These weeds oftentimes persist over a longer part of the season, and they can be a source of diseases that can then spread to crops grown inside of these protective structures, and so on. There are other weeds of concern as well. Point number 5, proper cultural practices. We talked about this under the IPM discussion, but here are some of the practices the farmers have shared with me over the years that are particularly important. First of all, maintain soil health. Soil health is critical from the standpoint of healthy growth of crop plants. And healthy plants are less prone to diseases, and in some cases they can actually actively combat diseases. So maintain soil health. Modify the environment. If you can keep plants dry, for example, you have fewer issues with a number of fungal and bacterial diseases. So growing crops in a protected environment can be very helpful from the standpoint of disease management. Rotation is critical. Here is broccoli showing a disease called black rot. It's a bacterial disease that strikes crops in this particular group, we call them the crucifers, and broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower. This disease can become persistent in places where the same crops are grown cycle after cycle after cycle. So an important way of managing this particular disease is to rotate to an unrelated crop in that growing space for at least 2 years. 3 years is even better. Good site preparation is important. And again, preparing a site by clearing away weeds that could become alternate hosts for pests and diseases is very helpful. Here we see a farm that is practicing 2 different site preparation practices. The first is occultation, where a tarp is drawn over the soil to eliminate germinating weed seeds. The second is the use of mulches. You can see that in the area above the area with the tarp. And the mulches provide a barrier to the soil. The plant will be planted through the mulch, and then the mulch will keep soil-borne diseases from splashing up onto the foliage of the crop plant. Weed management is very important. Here we see a high tunnel where, unfortunately, there's considerable weed growth just outside of the high tunnel. And if we look in the inside of the tunnel there at the far wall, we actually see weeds encroaching upon the production area. This is a dangerous situation because these weeds, again, can be a source of inoculum of a number of diseases which can then spread to the crop plants being grown inside that high tunnel. So control weeds in and around protective structures. Practice good planting design. Allow adequate space between plants for good air movement. Make sure that you have enough space between beds or between rows to allow for good air movement. Anything that you can do to encourage rapid drying of plants and the good movement of air around your plants will result in fewer disease issues during that cropping cycle. Another thing to consider, the use of mulches. In this case, we have woven landscape barrier fabric underneath the crops. And again, this gives us a protective layer between the soil and the crop plant itself, which helps prevent splash up of disease inoculum from the soil onto the foliage of the crop plant. Carefully consider irrigation. This is a good setup here where we have spinach plants growing with drip irrigation. Drip irrigation provides water to the soil where the plants need it, but it does not wet the crop plant. It does not wet the foliage or the fruit or the blossoms of the crop plant. And as we mentioned earlier, in many cases, particularly with bacterial and fungal diseases, having free water on the foliage or the fruit makes the infection situation much more serious. Anything we can do to keep our plants dry is helpful, and a drip or a trickle irrigation system will do just that. Mulches, we touched on this already, why it can be helpful to have a barrier between the soil and the crop itself. And here we see examples of several different types of mulches. We see a plastic mulch, a woven barrier, landscape barrier, fabric mulch, and way over on the left side we see an organic mulch. In this case, it's bark chips being used. Staking, training, and pruning, important. Here we see a tomato crop. We see the extensive use of mulches in this case, but we also see the use of stake and weave training to bring the plants up off the ground to encourage good air movement around the plants. Additional practices such as removal of the lower leaves and suckering of the plants will further encourage good air movement around these tomatoes. The next tactic that farmers mentioned to me is proper sanitation practices. Manage a clean farm. Remove debris, keep weeds under control. Make sure that you clean equipment that's used in farming practices. Looking at this picture here, we see a high tunnel in the background. It's a good practice to disinfect the inside of a high tunnel. Again, this is something as basic as washing down the metal structure of the high tunnel and making sure that the wooden components are clean as well. Monitor visitors. Would you invite these 2 gentlemen onto your farm? Well, actually, these 2 gentlemen are nationally known tomato experts, and this was at a tomato conference that Extension hosted recently. And we had a group of people who joined these experts to visit several tomato farms. Well, we didn't want to be the unwitting vectors of problems moving from one farm to the other. So everyone on the tour wore these blue bio booties and wore blue gloves. It's human nature to reach out and touch things. And by just touching an infected plant, you can unwittingly become a vector and spread virus problems, bacterial diseases, or even fungal problems. Shoes, the debris that accumulates on shoes has been implicated in the spread of a number of diseases, and especially in a high tunnel setting, it's very easy to walk inside of a high tunnel, and if you don't adequately clean your feet, moving to another high tunnel and spreading problems. So think about sanitation from the standpoint of people. If you go to visit another farmer's farm, be courteous and recognize the risk, but when you get home, make sure that you clean your shoes and wash your hands before you go to work with your crops. Equipment can be a very effective vector of problems, especially soil-borne diseases and nematodes. This is an example of a bed shaper, and this particular bed shaper has been thoroughly cleaned and sanitized as it was moved from one farm to another. But I've seen many situations where farmers share equipment and they don't take the time and energy to clean and sanitize equipment. Just a small amount of debris on a bed shaper can spread nematodes widely through planting areas on another farm. So be very cautious about sharing equipment and make sure that you clean and disinfect equipment. If you have beds that you know there's a problem, if you have beds, for example, with nematode issues, work those beds last and use a special care from the standpoint of cleaning and sanitizing equipment, tools, and yourself as you move from that bed to other parts of the farm. Frequent scouting is important. We talked about this earlier, but those farms who are interested in integrated pest management for diseases, and for that matter, long-term sustainability, those farmers are good diagnosticians. Those farmers are observant. They are in touch with what's going on in the environment in their farm. They know their crops and they know their diseases. And so they're always watching their plants, always watching for that first exhibition of a sign or a symptom. We saw this picture earlier. That farmer who's leaning over me is one of the best tomato farmers that I've worked with over the years. And you can't see it, but he also has his own 10x hand lens. And he and I are teaming up on this particular exercise. But he did unfortunately have some southern blight in that tunnel. We were looking to see how widespread the problem was. Notice the bio booties and the gloves. We were able to contain the infection and drop the problem to a manageable level. And then finally, plant protection products. This is the 8th strategy, and many farmers, in fact, most farmers use some sort of plant protection product, and that's a way of saying chemicals. Now, when we talk about plant protection products, there's 2 types that we focus on, and these are materials that are placed on plants as a preventative strategy before infection takes place, or in a few cases, we actually have plant protection products that have curative action. In other words, an infection may have taken place, but we can apply a material that can then eliminate the infection that's already active. Most plant protection products, most chemicals are preventative in nature, and they have to be in place on plants in advance of the conditions that favor infection. We talked about this earlier. This is the same slide I showed before under the discussion of IPM, but it has to be emphasized. If you're going to use pesticides of any sort, be they organic pesticides or non-organic pesticides, use the specific ones for specific issues, use at the lowest effective rate, use those that are short-lived in the environment, use those that are least toxic to beneficial organisms, alternate different chemical modes of action to prevent resistance, and yes, a general application may be needed initially, but follow up with spot applications only as needed. Here is an example of a table that lists a number of fungicides. And we have what is called the Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide. That's where I drew this from. And the guide has some very useful resources to help growers understand managing the risk of resistance, the development of resistance in plant pathogens. And if we look at this particular table, we'll notice, for example, we have the first column, which are trade names. We have the active ingredients. Then we have the pre-harvest intervals. But the important column is the one under the big blue arrow. And that's what's called the FRAC code. And FRAC code, FRAC stands for Fungicide Resistance Action Committee. And this is a group that takes a look at all of the fungicides that are labeled for use and then groups them together based upon their mode of action. And those fungicides that have similar modes of action, if you use fungicides that have similar modes of action time after time after time, then the fungus can develop resistance to that particular mode of action. And so it's important to understand what it means when we talk about alternating fungicides. And the way we do that is by choosing fungicides with different frac codes. For example, if we're looking at Cap10, Cap10 has a frac code of M. And let's say that our interest is in managing peach brown rot. Well, Cap10 is a pretty good fungicide from the standpoint of managing peach brown rot. But if we use Cap10 time after time after time after time, it's likely that we may see the development of resistance to Cap10. So let's alternate it with something like Abound. Abound has a different frac code. It's frac code 11. And by alternating that with Cap10, we can hopefully slow down the development of resistance. Perhaps we can stick even a different frac code in there, like Balaton, for example, which has a frac code of 3. And so we have a completely different mode of action. And by alternating among the different frac codes, the different modes of action, we can slow down the development of resistance in plant pathogens. We also have a group of plant protection products that are organic in nature, okay? And for growers who are interested in using these materials, an excellent resource is the Organic Materials Review Institute. It's abbreviated as OMRI. And frequently on packaging of organic materials, we'll see the OMRI designation. And if we look at this, this package of actinovate, which is an organic fungicide, we notice there about halfway up over on the right side, the OMRI trademark. And what OMRI does is they examine the labels and they certify them as being having characteristics that make them compatible with organic production systems. Most organic pesticides or biopesticides are based upon minerals or organisms. These minerals might be sulfur-based, copper-based, calcium polysulfide-based, or perhaps soaps or oils. And then among organisms, a couple of good examples are Serenade, which is Bacillus subtilis, and actinovate, which is Streptomyces lidicus. We do have a few biological derivatives and plant sources for fungicides too. But again, check out the OMRI listing if you ever have a question about whether or not a fungicide would be suitable for an organic production system. We talked about this as well. The use of chemical pesticides, plant protection products may be needed even if we're using other strategies. Obviously, you want to understand the label and follow it to the letter, and then recognize the pesticides are just one choice. We don't want to use them indiscriminately. We use them only after deliberation, and sometimes their choice is based upon economic viability. A couple of very useful guides from the standpoint of plant protection chemicals, both organic and non-organic, are these two production guides, the Midwest Vegetable Production Guide and the Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide. Both of these are updated regularly. They're available in hard copy, and they're also both available online as downloadable PDFs. And if you do just a quick Google search for Midwest and then add in Vegetable Spray Guide or Fruit Spray Guide, you will come to these particular publications. Extremely helpful, very useful guides. And they're more than just lists of pesticides. They include information on selecting adapted cultivars, information on phenology and disease appearance, and then information on some specialized topics like fruit thinning and weed control. Now, we've talked about the top 8 strategies that farmers have shared over the years as being effective in managing diseases. Let's put it all together with a particular case study. And we're going to talk about Alternaria blight of tomato. Alternaria is a ubiquitous disease. It's found worldwide. It's certainly a problem in Missouri and in the Midwest. It can show up in several ways. It can show up as a leaf disease, as a stem disease, or as a fruit disease. So the first strategy that farmers shared with us is to know your crops. If you're purchasing tomato seed to grow your own transplants, make sure that it's clean. And reputable nurseries will treat seed in such a way that it's clean of diseases such as Alternaria. If you're buying transplants, do examine them closely. Looking at this picture here, notice the yellowish area on the transplant leaf there. That's Alternaria. That transplant is already infected with Alternaria. And again, you want to be very cautious about this if you're purchasing planting stock. Now, of course, we need to understand Alternaria. We have to understand the pattern of symptoms, not just on the leaves where we commonly see it, but also on the stems and on the fruit. Frequently, these lesions, especially when they show up on the leaf or on the on the stem, and the fruit as well, are somewhat concentric in nature, which means they look a bit like a bullseye. And again, this is where the term concentric rings comes from. And if you see that, that's a pretty strong indication that you're dealing with an Alternaria infection. So again, important to understand the disease. It's caused by two different fungi, Alternaria tomatophila and Alternaria solani. It overwinters in infected plant debris and in the soil. So in other words, this should be a light should be coming on here. What can we do to make the environment less favorable, or to make to attack that corner of the disease triangle? Well, maybe we need to clean up this plant debris. It also survives on tomato seed and may be introduced on tomato transplants. We already talked about that. Lower leaves become infected when in contact with contaminated soil, and this can happen either through direct contact or through rain splash soil. A light should be coming on here. What can we do to manage this disease by thinking about this? Spores can germinate over a wide temperature range, but they need free water, okay, or high humidity. So a light should be coming on here. What can we do to minimize free water on the plants? What can we do to manage humidity? And the spores can be spread throughout the field by wind, human contact. There's another light that should be going on, or equipment. Another light should be going on here as well. Choose cultivars carefully. There's my grandson again holding on to Juliet. Juliet is resistant to Alternaria. And you're looking for the key initials EB or AB on labeling. And in the case of tomatoes, many tomatoes carry multiple genetic resistance to diseases, and you'll see designations such as F or N or other letters, and these refer to specific diseases. In the case of Alternaria, they'll be EB or AB. And here's a list of some of the resistant cultivars. Very important to eliminate wild hosts. And black nightshade is in the Solanaceous family, along with the horse nettle that we saw earlier. And black nightshade in particular is prone for Alternaria. Another issue is volunteer tomato seedlings. So again, make sure that you eliminate any quote-unquote wild tomatoes. Proper cultural practices. Growing tomatoes under protected culture can be huge in managing Alternaria. This picture was a situation that really brought it home to me. So here we see a row of tomatoes that is under a caterpillar tunnel, but the last 10 feet or so of the row were outside of the caterpillar tunnel. Those plants are dead because of Alternaria, whereas the plants underneath the protection of the caterpillar tunnel are doing just fine and are productive parts of that planting. So again, just changing the environment to reduce the presence of free water on the plants has been huge from the standpoint of reducing Alternaria. Some other cultural practices: proper fertility management. Avoid working in plants when they are wet from rain, irrigation, or dew. Use drip irrigation to keep the foliage dry. Stake the plants to increase airflow. Use a plastic or organic mulch to reduce humidity and to provide that barrier between contaminated soil and the foliage. At the end of the production cycle, remove infected plants. Again, this is an important part of managing Alternaria. And then for greenhouse production, it's found that by using UV absorbing vinyl film on the high tunnel, we can actually reduce Alternaria infection by as much as 50%. So there's another example of a cultural practice that we can do. On many farms, again, sanitation at the end of the production cycle, get those infected plants out of there. It's also helpful to sanitize your stakes and cages, to sanitize the inside of the tunnel, and to do what you can to reduce the amount of inoculum that overwinters around the place where you're going to be growing those tomatoes next year. There are a number of fungicides that are helpful in managing Alternaria. They are listed in the Midwest Vegetable Production Guide. Make sure that you follow the labels carefully and repeat the applications as necessary. Alternaria is very prone to developing resistance, so rotation among fungicides is very important. And again, just to review the top 8 things to manage diseases: know your crops, know the diseases, choose cultivars carefully, eliminate wild hosts, proper cultural practices, proper sanitation practices, frequent scouting, and plant protection products. And that brings us to the conclusion of our presentation, our workshop on plant diseases and plant disease management. That picture kind of says it all. You can see my feet encased in my bio booties. I want to thank you for joining me for this workshop. And Hannah, do we have any questions in the chat at this point?
It looks like we don't have any questions in the chat. Thank you so much for joining us, Patrick.
Oh, my pleasure. This was a very enjoyable workshop, and hopefully it provokes some thought among the attendees in how to grow crops in such a way that we can minimize issues related to diseases.